All right, folks, welcome to our next lecture for History 310B. In my last lecture, we talked about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was really the end of the 1970s, both chronologically in terms of the calendar. The invasion happens at the end of 1979, but also the Soviet invasion ends the 1970s in terms of being the final nail in the coffin of the hopes for an improved U.S.-Soviet relationship that had marked the start of the decade. The early 70s, it looked like they were moving towards détente, and as I talked about in the last lecture, a couple of lectures before that, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan alone isn't what killed détente, but it's really what finished off any hopes for it in the short term. Now, and then Mathieu, of course, was kind enough to give us that guest lecture and talk in further detail about this very interesting and I think geopolitically very pivotal region of Central Asia. And then to go back to where I left off at the end of my last lecture, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the American response to it, really sets the stage for the fellow who is definitely one of the most polarizing figures of the last century of American politics, the so-called father of the neoconservative revolution, namely Ronald Reagan. Now, what matters to us, of course, in this class is Reagan's attitude and actions with regard to the Cold War. Reagan came into office. He won a landslide victory, and you can see the Electoral College map here again. Reagan wins by a country mile. He comes into office with a landslide victory, and he comes into office with a determination that he needs to make America strong again. Reagan thought that the U.S. had grown weak under Jimmy Carter. I talked about the Jimmy Carter sense of malaise, and Reagan decides he's the guy who's going to fix that. And Reagan has a major success on literally his first day in office when the Iranian hostages are released. And so that gives, his administration a nice boost from the very start. There's a lot of speculation. It's not absolutely certain, but it's plausible that the hostages could have been released a little bit earlier, and this might have been deliberately delayed until, I said, Reagan was technically in office, and so he would reap the political benefits. But certainly, like I said, that's very good news for your first day as president. The Iranian hostages are coming home. Now, of course, as part of Reagan's general platform of reasserting American strength and American confidence, Reagan wanted to take a stronger stance against the Soviet Union. And so he really ramps up the anti-Soviet Cold War rhetoric. At a press conference on the 29th of January 1981, so just a few days after his inauguration, Reagan was asked by Sam Donaldson of ABC News. Donaldson asked, in this direct quote here, "Mr. President, what do you see as the long-term intentions of the Soviet Union? Do you think, for instance, the Kremlin is bent on world domination that might lead to a continuation of the Cold War? Or do you think that other circumstances, détente is possible?" End quote. So Donaldson is saying, look, are the communists trying to take over the world? Or maybe we don't have détente right now, but is it possible to perhaps restart détente under other circumstances? And here's Reagan's answer. Quote, "Well, so far détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims." So, saying détente was a waste of time. The Soviets were just using it for their own benefit. They didn't actually care about peace. Well, so far détente's been a one-way street that the Soviet Union has used to pursue its own aims. I don't have to think of an answer as to what I think their intentions are. They have repeated it. I know of no leader of the Soviet Union since the revolution, and including the present leadership, that has not more than once repeated in the various communist congresses they hold their determination that their goal must be the promotion of world revolution and a one-world socialist or communist state, whichever word you want to use. Now, as long as they do that, and as long as they at the same time have openly and publicly declared that the only morality they recognize is what will further their cause, meaning that they reserve unto themselves the right to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat in order to attain that, and that is moral, not immoral, and we operate on a different set of standards, I think when you do business with them, even at a détente, you keep that in mind. End quote. So Reagan is saying the Soviets are bent on world revolution. Détente was a sham. That phrase "one-way street" is something that would get repeated a lot. So Reagan is saying, it said the Soviets are bent on world revolution. They don't actually care about peace, and that the Soviets will have no decency in their pursuit of that goal of world revolution. Now, when Reagan says that the Soviets have admitted that they want a one-world communist state, he's not technically wrong. This was a goal of the Bolsheviks at the time of the revolution, and many other communists throughout the world as well. And as Reagan says, that goal was never renounced. He's telling the truth when he says it was repeated time and time again. What Reagan is not recognizing, probably deliberately, he probably knows better and is just sort of pretending not to, but we never know exactly what goes on in somebody's head. What Reagan is probably deliberately not recognizing is that even though this was something that the Soviets always said, by the 1980s, nobody in the Soviet Union or the rest of the world actually believes in this idea of communist world revolution anymore. It was boilerplate. If you ever have the misfortune of reading as many Soviet speeches as I have, things from, as Reagan talks about, Communist Party congresses and Revolution Day parades and these sorts of things like that, if you read a bunch of these, you'll notice that the Soviet leaders over the decades repeat themselves constantly. They would find a slogan or find a formulation that they like and repeat it literally for decades until it just sort of becomes background noise. And this was part of a phenomenon that Soviet citizens referred to as novoyaz, or newspeak, and there's tons of Soviet jokes about these sort of extremely boring and repetitive and very stilted language that Soviet officials used, like referring to October 1917 as, and this is a direct quote here, as, quote, the starting point of a new epoch of human progress and the true history of mankind, truly mankind's hour of genius and its morning dawn, end quote. Again, you'll hear phrases like that. The same phrases just pop up again in speech after speech, year after year. Soviet official language is filled with these repeated phrases. And while I don't have a specific example here in front of me, certainly there were plenty of these repeated phrases that talked about striving for world socialist revolution. So, as I said, Reagan isn't technically lying. He's not technically incorrect. But Reagan at least pretends to take these words literally. And if you take them literally, certainly they do sound like the Soviet Union's goals. And so, like I said, Reagan is technically correct, although he's ignoring the fact that no one else has really taken them very seriously since about the 1960s. In the revolutionary period, a lot of the Soviet leaders and some of the enthusiasts of the revolution, and as I said, communists all over the world, took these ideas very seriously. Party members believed then, under the 1930s and Stalinist propaganda, a lot of Soviet citizens still believed that this is the goal. By the Khrushchev era, Khrushchev probably believes in this, but the Soviet public is starting to become increasingly cynical. And, by the late 60s, by the 70s, in the Brezhnev era, this had become something that was simply repeated as a matter of form. Sort of like, it always reminds me a little bit of the way that the Europeans talked about preparing their colonies in Africa or Asia for independence. It would have been very bad form not to say it, but these were just empty words that were usually meant to be forgotten by the next breath. But as I said, Reagan takes them literally, at least pretends to take them seriously, and says, look, the Soviets are trying to pursue world communist revolution. Certainly the Soviets were trying to pursue the spread of Soviet power in the Cold War, just as the Americans were. Whether they actually believed that global Marxist revolution was around the corner, as per Marxist ideology, as I said, this becomes very dubious by the late 60s and into the 70s. So as I said, Reagan comes in with this, new harsher attitude and harsher rhetoric. Probably the most famous example of Reagan's new tone, the new heightened rhetoric, takes place a few years later, 1983. 1983 will be a pivotal year, and that's mostly what I'll be talking about here in the lecture here today. On March the 8th, 1983, Reagan famously referred to the Soviet Union as a, quote, evil empire. Now, Reagan said this during a speech in Orlando, Florida, given, as you can see, to the National Association of Evangelicals. And National Association of Evangelicals, the Evangelical Christians, what we might uncharitably refer to as Bible thumpers, and so perhaps that audience influenced Reagan's choice of words. Good speakers tailor their message to their audience. He's speaking to, as I said, very loud and proud, praise the Lord Christians, and so casting the Cold War in these very black and white moralistic terms perhaps sort of fits that audience well. In any case, here's what Reagan said. He gave you the evil empire quote, but I'll put it in a little bit of context with the lines that are around it. Here's what Reagan said, quote, "So I urge you to speak out against those who would place the United States in a position of military and moral inferiority. So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil." End quote. Now, I skipped over one line there, but you get the gist of it there. He's saying, don't see the Cold War as I said, just a misunderstanding, or as both sides have good and bad, or something like that. This is a war between good and the evil side is the Soviet Union. So with this, as I said, increasingly harsh rhetoric, it appears that Cold War tensions are rising again. So far we've essentially been talking about rhetoric. What about actual policy? Reagan pushes things a big step further on March the 23rd, 1983, when he proposes the Strategic Defense Initiative, often referred to simply as the Star Wars program. The idea, which had been percolating for several years before it was announced, the idea was to use outer space as the place to shoot down Soviet ICBMs, using a variety of means, lasers, particle beams, as well as more traditional ground-based missiles. They're going to track and destroy the missiles in space before they could come down and hit their target. Now, this diagram sort of ostensibly shows how the SDI, or the Star Wars program, was supposed to work. If you're having trouble making sense of the diagram, don't worry. It is very complicated. The details were very highly subject to debate. To say the least, the SDI was an extraordinarily ambitious idea. Whether or not this system was even scientifically possible in theory was considerably disputed at the time, let alone actually putting theory into practice. And as I'm sure you'll notice, we're almost 40 years later, we're still not even seriously talking about doing something like this. So yes, ambitious is the very least that we can call this idea. Of course, to even try to do something like this would cost a buttload of money. It was assumed that the bill of the SDI would be at least $100 billion with a B dollars, $40 billion to be spent in the first period of 10 years until 1993. Some people thought this idea was crazy. Others thought it was interesting. Reagan was insistent on pushing ahead with it, both from the moral conviction that people should have some sort of possible defense against nuclear annihilation. The video you watched for the second discussion, they talked about the Soviets saying, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to fear nuclear weapons? So part of it was simply this moral conviction that, like I said, it would be nice to not have to worry about being nuked. And also because Reagan thought this would put pressure on the Soviets. The SDI put the USSR in something of a bind regarding what to do. The Soviet scientists thought these ideas were unrealistic and it very likely wouldn't work. It certainly wouldn't work anytime soon. It certainly wouldn't work in any foreseeable, plausibly near future at shooting down the entire Soviet arsenal if they launched a massive first strike. But the Soviets at the same time, like I said, so they thought it was sort of foolishness, it's not going to work, but they couldn't ignore the idea entirely either. What if the system partly worked? What if it worked well enough? There's a nightmare scenario from Moscow's standpoint. What if it worked well enough to shoot down the limited number of missiles that the Soviets might have left after an American first strike? What if it was just intended to sort of mop up the Soviet response, and that perhaps could imply the Americans were thinking of striking first? This SDI greatly undermines the principle of mutually assured destruction. It wasn't technically a violation of the letter of the ABM agreement at the time of the ABM agreement in the early 70s. It never occurred to anyone to put in a ban on space-based laser weapons to shoot down nukes. Like I said, it was simply, at that time was, it was still a far-fetched idea in the early 80s. A decade earlier, it had been that much more far-fetched an idea, and then no one even would have even thought about putting it into the treaty. So it wasn't technically a violation of the ABM treaty, but certainly it would throw the principle of MAD right out the window. By the same token, is again going to this idea, what if it didn't work entirely, but it partially worked? What if it didn't work well at all for shooting down missiles, but the Americans still got valuable spin-off technology from the attempt? SDR would have needed better satellites, better tracking technology, talks about new types of laser weapons and particle beam weapons, these possibly, game-changing types of weapons. So what if any of these particular elements work? Even if the system as a whole does not, then that would give the Americans an advantage in the arms race and an advantage in the Cold War. So the Soviets, like I said, they it's ungodly expensive, and the Soviets think it's a waste of money because it's not going to work, but they feel a certain amount of pressure to follow suit anyway, because, like I said, what if even parts of it work? That will leave the Soviets potentially in the dust. And of course, spending this money to keep up with it was a real problem. By the 80s, the Soviet economy is seriously slowing down. It couldn't keep pace with population growth, and standards of living were starting to lag. And remember, we talked about this idea of goulash communism. The Brezhnev regime, one of their keys to preserving power was keeping standards of living up. And so it's hard to keep standards of living up already. And now they might have to spend $1 gazillion on this science fiction idea that Reagan has proposed. So, as I said, even though the Soviets don't really think SDI will work and it's a colossal waste of money, they couldn't even begin to afford the cost of trying. But on the other hand, if they didn't at least try, then this could put them in a vastly weakened position. Now, something some of you might be thinking of here, and there's a key debate going on, and it's a debate that still doesn't have a clear answer, is how much of this did Reagan understand? Whether or not this, I said Reagan's a very polarizing figure, and a lot of people love him and a lot of people hate him. And whenever you get into these sort of politicized debates, good scholarship becomes very, very difficult. Reagan's, so how much, how much of this was a plan on Reagan's part is said to be a big debate. Reagan's critics tend to say that he pursued the SDI for these simplistic moral reasons. Won't it be nice to have a shield against nukes? And, generally that implies that Reagan was oblivious to principles like mutually assured destruction. And I said, again, this tendency to portray Reagan as simply this big dummy who doesn't understand the complexities of international politics. Reagan's defenders, on the other hand, they tend to see it as a cunning plan on Reagan's part. He didn't necessarily need to care whether or not it worked. It was as I said, a cunning plan, a clever means of putting pressure on the Soviets to spend money they don't have, and thus allow the Americans to win the Cold War by making the Soviets go broke. Now, again, so like I said, exactly what Reagan thought is still very difficult to determine. When you consider that, we often sort of boil down the government to the leader and talk in these very simplistic terms, particularly in lectures and so forth. But the presidential administration is not just one person, and a massive project like this has lots of people involved. It's certainly possible that there was a lot of overlap between these two motives, and the two motives aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. It's not like you could only have one or only have the other. So again, Reagan is this polarizing figure. He either comes up with this idiotic pipe dream or this cunning plan, and that to build the strategic defense initiative. And of course, the way events play out makes it very difficult for us to tell, even with hindsight, what Reagan was actually thinking, and perhaps moot. We'll talk about why the Cold War ends later on, but certainly the certainly financial pressures are part of what brought down the Soviet Union. Tying that directly to the Star Wars program is perhaps not impossible, but perhaps a bit trickier. And as the Cold War ends, the Star Wars program is wound down in the 1990s under Clinton. And I talked a little bit a few lectures ago about the early 2000s, the early 20th century W. Bush. Brought in the sort of missile defense system, but that, as I believe I said then, is far less ambition. This is essentially just a return to something along with ABM, something that, the current U.S. missile defense system doesn't seem to be. Again, nobody knows. The details, of course, of it are classified, but the general consensus in the scholarly community is it's probably not designed or effective against a massive strike, like if Russia was going to suddenly launch all their nukes tomorrow. It's probably aimed against a small strike by a rogue state in the short term, presumably North Korea, possibly Iran or something like that. It can't shoot down 800 nukes, but it might be able to shoot down 8. And, if there's only 8 launched, then that's a pretty good system. So again, like I said, the Star Wars program was much, much bolder. It's this science fiction technology that Reagan is absolutely emphatic that they want to do. His motivations for that remain unclear, or at least mixed. So, as I said, Reagan proposing the SDI really kind of puts the Soviets in this bind where they don't feel like they can keep up and they don't feel like they can ignore it. Reagan proposing the Strategic Defense Initiative also worries the Soviets because it made them seriously wonder if there was something else going on. What if the Americans are up to something here? Did they have some kind of a game changer waiting in the wings? Perhaps the Americans were closer to this technology, or at least parts of it, than the Soviets realized. Perhaps Reagan's announcement of the Strategic Defense Initiative was just a plain attempt to escalate tension for its own sake. Reagan talks about how terrible the Soviet Union is all the time. Maybe he's just trying to pave the way for an all-out war, and so just ramp up the tension until said the public is going to be on side, and any sort of little pretext could become the excuse for war. So the SDI, among other things, it really heightens Soviet suspicions, and it makes the Soviets somewhat paranoid that the Americans are preparing some kind of a sneak attack. And once the Kremlin starts feeling this sort of escalated sense of anxiety, everything else starts to look much more suspicious or much more threatening. Remember, the Soviet Union was absolutely devastated after a surprise attack by Germany in June of 1941. And a lot of the Soviet citizenry and pretty much all of the Soviet leaders, they still remember this very, very vividly 4 decades later. Again, most of the Soviet leaders by this period, they're in their 60s or 70s, meaning they were in their 20s or 30s, when one morning they woke up to find out that Germany has attacked. And as I said, that war, as I talked about earlier in the course, that war was absolutely ruinous for the Soviet Union. Tens of millions killed, tremendous physical devastation, and then so forth. So for the Soviets, this sort of fear of a surprise attack isn't abstract. Again, this fear of the Americans will often have a fear during the Cold War of a Soviet surprise attack, but it's a mostly abstract fear. In the Soviet Union, particularly among the leadership generation, this fear was very real. It was very visceral. It was very deep-seated. It's sometimes referred to as this 1941 psychosis. Oh my God, what if this happens again? And as I said, that heightens anxiety a great deal. And once the anxiety is heightened, then everything else seems like such a bigger deal. So Reagan is heightening the rhetoric, and then he proposes this incredible new idea of the Star Wars program. And then furthermore, in 1983, the Americans start what we see here in the slide. The Americans start deploying an upgraded medium-range missile in Europe, the Pershing II missile. And the Pershing II was essentially just an American response to the Soviet SS-20 that we talked about a little bit earlier in this course in the context of the decline of détente. But the Soviets, now they see a technological upgrade as a threat. pardon me, why are they bringing these? These missiles could hit Soviets, hit Western Soviet cities in a space of 4 to 6 minutes, which would provide us virtually no warning at all. And so again, why are the Americans, Reagan's talking about how terrible the Soviet Union is, and now he's putting in these weapons that can do untold damage incredibly quickly. And so, as I said, you combine this with all the other factors I mentioned, and Harper talks further about this issue. Again, the Soviet Union starts to be extremely fearful in 1983 that the Americans might be planning an actual attack. The Soviets are becoming more and more paranoid about American surprise attack in 1983, and then on the 1st of September, a civilian airliner, Korean Airlines Flight 007, accidentally wanders off course and into Soviet restricted airspace. Now, even though it's very clearly looked like a civilian airliner, I think it was a 747, I forget exactly what model it was, but it was, it was the kind of, the giant passenger plane that you'll see if you ever fly to Toronto or to Australia or whatever. It's one of these civilian jumbo jets. Very clearly looks like this. But the Soviets were afraid that this was just a disguise for a spy mission. And so they shoot the flight down with a fighter jet, killing all 269 people aboard. Now, this shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007, this made the Soviet Union look either brutal or incompetent or both. Did they know it was a civilian airliner and shoot it down, or were they too stupid to realize that this was just a civilian airliner? Neither outcome makes the Soviets look particularly good. It also, of course, makes the Soviet Union look dishonest. The Soviets denied shooting down the flight for a while until the evidence became impossible to deny. So again, there's this heightened sense of fear, and then this civilian plane, for sort of technical reasons, wanders off course and into what was a very militarily sensitive area for the Soviet Union. And again, the Soviet response is, what if this is preparatory to an American first strike? What if they're gathering intelligence and just using a civilian airliner to do it, or pretending to look like a civilian airliner while they do it? Characteristically, Reagan uses this as yet another opportunity to ramp up the rhetoric. He refers to this as the Korean Airlines massacre, and he calls it a crime against humanity and so forth. So again, it heightens the tension that much further. And even after it clearly was a civilian airliner, it doesn't preclude the possibility that they might have been trying to take some secret photographs or something while they were doing it. Ironically, one of the people on board who died was a Democratic congressman from Georgia by the name of Larry McDonald. And Larry McDonald, the reason why his death in this fashion was ironic, Larry McDonald was the president of the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society is a far-right, radically anti-communist organization who were somewhat influential, and they were always pushing for a harder stance during the Cold War, as well as opposing the civil rights movement as a communist conspiracy. And so, as I said, the leader of this radically anti-communist organization actually is killed by a Soviet fighter jet. Now, I say the John Birch Society is an organization that believes these things, not was, because they do still exist and operate. Their numbers and influence are much less than they were during the Cold War, although apparently their membership numbers saw an increase for the first time in God knows how long. They see something of a resurgence during the Trump administration. There's somewhat of a boost for the John Birch Society. So, pardon me, as I said, the shooting down of Korean Airlines Flight 007 ramps up the Cold War that much further, ramps up the tension that much further, and, pardon me, and again, this sort of ironic footnote of killing the leader of one of the most prominent anti-Soviet organizations in the United States. Now, this is a bit of a tangent from the narrative I'm talking about here in 1983, but I can't in good conscience mention Korean Airlines 007 without mentioning that a few years later, July of 1988, the U.S. Navy used a surface-to-air missile to shoot down an Iranian civilian airliner, Iran Air Flight 655 from Tehran to Dubai, killing all 290 people on board. It's still not clear why they shot it down. Pardon me, the Korean Airlines 007 had actually, gone places it was not supposed to go. Pardon me, Iran Air 655 was on its regular flight path in Iranian airspace, and the Americans had shot it down with a ship-based surface-to-air missile. Perhaps the Americans misread it as an Iranian F-14 Tomcat, a fighter jet that the Americans had provided to Iran back when it was still under the Shah. But as I said, we still don't really have a clear understanding of why it happened. But just as the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, the Americans shot down Iran Air Flight 655. And suffice it to say, July of '88, when this happens, Reagan is still president, but he certainly does not hype it the same way that he had when the Soviets had shot down a civilian airliner. So between, as I said, Reagan's rhetoric, the SDI, the deployment of the Pershing II, the shooting down of KAL 007, that, as I said, the Soviets still weren't 100% convinced wasn't on an attempt to gather secret info, or perhaps maybe they were sort of trying to trick the Soviets, provide a pretext for an American attack. Like I said, all of these possibilities are just sort of cascading and creating this cascading anxiety in the Kremlin leadership. 1983, Andropov, pardon me, is the leader of the Soviet Union at this point, and I'll talk about him in the next lecture. But he had been the Soviet ambassador to Hungary in 1956, and he had seen the crowds rise up and string up members of the Hungarian secret police and so forth. So he's perhaps had particular, anxieties about how suddenly things can go wrong. And so, like I said, there's a lot of concern in the Kremlin that all of this is building up to something big like an American attack. 1983 is a year of very high tension, probably the second closest that the world ever came to outright nuclear war. Then possible disaster strikes again just after midnight on the 26th of September, so just a few weeks after KAL 007. 26th of September, the Soviet early warning system detects an American intercontinental ballistic missile launch. The Americans are sending a nuke at the Soviet Union. As per the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the Soviet policy was to launch an immediate nuclear counterattack, but the officer who was monitoring the system, the fellow you see here, Stanislav Petrov, he just figures, well, if the Americans were going to attack, they're probably not going to attack with just one missile. That doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And so he basically said to himself, it's a new computer, Soviet computers are shit, and so he basically just ignores it. This, threat comes up that the Americans have launched a nuke, and Petrov is basically the guy who's watching the monitor and sees this, and he just, no, that's not what's happening. Like I said, he basically just ignores it. It's still not clear whether or not he even reports it to his superior. He just basically, like I said, completely disregards it, and thus Petrov becomes the second Soviet officer to save the world from nuclear war. We talked about Vasily Arkhipov, who, as we recall, was on that sub during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in fact, the system would go on to tell Petrov that 4 more American missiles were coming as well, but Petrov remained convinced that this was just a computer error, and they later figured out, presumably, what that error actually was. This incident became known to the public in 1998, and Petrov was eventually honored by the United Nations in 2006. You can see here a picture of him receiving his World Citizen Award. So like I said, there's this ramped up tension. The Soviets are afraid that an American attack is coming, and then he's, watching the monitor, and an American missile seems to be on its way. And like I said, he just says, no, this can't be happening, and thus doesn't retaliate. The Soviet Union doesn't retaliate, and we didn't know about this at the time, but again, this was a very potentially a very near miss. Now, the height of the 1983 war scare occurs in November due to an exercise that's referred to as Able Archer 83. So the tension is building up and up and up, and it reaches its peak in November. What Able Archer was, it was an annual war game. It was a training exercise whereby all the NATO countries basically got together to practice how they would fight a Soviet invasion of Europe. Now, as I said, it was an annual exercise, but the one in 1983 was considerably larger and more sophisticated and more realistic than usual. Government leaders participated personally. Margaret Thatcher of Britain did. Helmut Kohl of West Germany did. There was new regulations about radio silence. Again, basically, like I said, it was not a new type of training exercise, but they just seemed to be taking it much, much more seriously, as well as involving, as I said, larger numbers of troops. So while the training exercise was discussed openly, again, informing each other of large training exercises so as to not make the other side jittery had become part of the Cold War. So the training exercise was discussed openly, but when you put it on top of everything else that was happening that year, the Soviets were somewhat afraid that all of these troops allegedly gathering for a war game might just be a cover story for preparations for a real invasion of the Soviet Union. Able Archer ran as scheduled from November the 7th to the 11th, and then afterwards, all these NATO troops dispersed back to their home countries, and the Kremlin presumably breathes a sigh of relief, and that seems to have been the end of the war scare of 1983. So as I said, 83 was probably the second closest that the world ever came to nuclear war. I'm perhaps dramatizing it a little bit here. Exactly how close the world came to nuclear war is still not very clear. How much did the Soviets believe the Americans would actually attack? How seriously were the Soviets debating whether they should strike first? If you know your opponent is going to attack, then usually it makes sense to strike first. And so, if the Soviet leadership had become sufficiently certain that the Americans were going to attack, then maybe they might have struck first. How close like I said, how much the Soviets actually believed this first attack might be coming, how close they were to considering a preemptive strike still remains unclear. It will remain unclear for a long time until we get better access to the Russian archives. But certainly the Cold War is ramping up in the early 80s under Reagan. Pardon me. Next lecture will be a bit of a digression into the subject of nuclear weapons to help set up next week's online discussion. And then the lecture after that will come back pardon me, to Reagan. And I said Reagan starts out very much by heightening the rhetoric. At the same time, he was willing to talk to the Soviets about peace. And that is, we won't necessarily talk about that first thing, but we'll get to that in the lecture after next.